The house didn't feel like a cage until the moment I realized someone was holding the key. It was a Tuesday, a night so unremarkable it should have faded into the thousands of other Tuesdays I'd spent in that living room. There were no warnings, no sudden shifts in the atmosphere, and certainly no thunder to signal the storm brewing inside my own skin. There was just the low electric hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the flickering, pale blue glow of a nature documentary on. The screen that Julian, my husband, had retreated upstairs hours ago. His back had been acting up again, or perhaps it was just the weight of a 30-year marriage that had grown too heavy for his spine to carry. He took his pills, kissed my forehead with the same mechanical precision he used to lock the front door, and vanished into the bedroom. His absence wasn't a void, it was a relief. That was the first truth I had to admit to myself. Our life together had become a series of polite maneuvers, a choreographed dance where we avoided stepping on each other's toes by never getting close enough to touch. Gabriel was still there, sitting on the far end of the sectional. I'd known him since he was in diapers. He was Sarah's son, my best friend's boy, the kid who used to scrape his knees on my driveway and ask for extra popsicles, but the boy was gone. In his place sat a man with broad shoulders and a quiet, watchful intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. He had come over to help Julian move some heavy furniture earlier that day, and then Sarah had called to say she was running late from her shift at the hospital. I'd offered him dinner. It felt natural. It felt safe until at DIDN single quotes T dot we were watching the screen, but neither of us was seeing the lions on the savannah. I could feel the heat radiating from him. It was a physical presence, a magnetic pull that I tried to ignore by staring intensely at the television. Then his leg shifted. It wasn't a large movement, just a casual adjustment of his weight, but his thigh brushed against mine. I expected a quick apology. A sorry about that, followed by a respectful distance. But Gabriel didn't move. He left his leg there, pressed firmly against mine, a bridge of heat connecting two separate worlds. My heart didn't just beat. It thudded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told myself it was an accident. I told myself he was just tired, lost in the movie, unaware of the contact. But then his hand moved Dot. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly certain. His fingers didn't grab, they grazed. He rested the tips of his fingers on the fabric of my leggings, just above the knee. The contact was so light, it was almost a ghost of a touch, yet it felt like a brand. I froze. I stopped breathing, my lungs, holding on to the stale air of the living room as if letting it out would shatter the moment. I didn't pull away. That was my first betrayal, not the touch itself, but the stillness with which I accepted it. He waited. He was giving me every chance to stand up, to make a joke, to go to the kitchen for a glass of water, to end the narrative before the first chapter was even written. But I stayed. I stayed because, for the first time in a decade, I felt like I existed. I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a neighbor. I wasn't Auntie Elena. I was a woman, and there was a man beside me whose heartbeat I could practically hear through the silence. His hand shifted fully, his palm turning upward in the space between us, resting on the cushion like an open question. I looked down at it. His skin was tan, his knuckles dusted with light hair, his fingers long and steady. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was waiting for a response. I didn't take his hand, but I let my own fingers twitch toward him. The tension in the room grew so dense I felt like I was underwater. Elena? He whispered Dot the way he said my name. It wasn't the way Julian said it. Julian said my name when he wanted to know where the car keys were or what time we were supposed to be at the fundraiser. Gabriel said it like it was a secret he'd been keeping in his mouth for a long time. I'm okay, I whispered back, though it was a lie. I was the opposite of okay. I was unraveling, His hand settled on my thigh, firm and warm. It wasn't a tentative touch anymore. It was a claim. He wasn't looking at the TV. He was looking at me, and though I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, I could feel the weight of his gaze. It was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I had buried under layers of laundry, grocery lists, and social obligations. He saw the woman who used to paint, the woman who used to dance in the rain, the woman who hadn't been touched with genuine hunger in years. Loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't always feel like being alone. It feels like being forgotten while you're standing right in front of someone. Julian and I had reached a point where we were two ghosts haunting the same hallways. We were kind to each other, we were supportive, but we were empty. I had accepted that emptiness as the price of stability. I thought that being fine was the best I could hope for at this stage of my life, but as Gabriel's thumb began to stroke the curve of my leg, a slow rhythmic movement that sent jolts of electricity through my entire body, I realized I wasn't fine. I was starving. I closed my eyes for a second, my head falling back against the sofa. I felt his breath on my neck, a warm puff of air that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He leaned in, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my soul. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said. "Just tell me to stop. I'll leave right now, and we'll never speak of it again." I wanted to say it. I opened my mouth to tell him to go, to remind him who he was and who I was. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, and my knees fell slightly apart. It was an invitation, a silent surrender. I felt his hand slide higher, cautious but persistent, and I didn't stop him. I didn't stop him when his fingers slipped beneath the hem of my shorts. I didn't stop him when he leaned closer, his chest brushing against my arm. Finally, I turned my head. Our eyes met, and the world outside that dimly lit room simply ceased to exist. There was no Julian upstairs. There was no Sarah. There was no past and no future. There was only the heat of the present. I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear. That was in mine, the knowledge that we were crossing a line from which there was no return. When I kissed him, it wasn't a mistake. You can't call something that intentional a mistake. It was an explosion of everything I had suppressed. It was the taste of rebellion and the scent of wood smoke and old leather. It was desperate and honest and terrifying. His hands were in my hair, pulling me closer, and I felt the strength in him, the raw vitality that had been missing from my life for so long. He left that night before the clock struck midnight. He didn't say much, and neither did I. We just stood by the door, the cool night air hitting my face as he stepped out onto the porch. He looked back once, his expression unreadable, and then he was gone. I walked upstairs and climbed into bed. Beside Julian, I listened to his rhythmic, shallow breathing. I looked at the familiar shape of his back, the way he always curled toward the window. I felt like a stranger in my own bed. My skin was still buzzing from Gabriel's touch, and the silence of the house felt louder than it ever had before. I lay there until the sun began to bleed through the curtains, staring at the ceiling, wondering when I had become someone who could do this. The days that followed were a blur of performance. I was the perfect wife. I made Julian's favorite breakfast. I organized the pantry. I called Sarah and talked about the weather, but every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that couch. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped. I was living in a state of constant high vibration anxiety, wait for the other shoe to drop. Gabriel didn't come over for a week. I thought maybe that was it. Maybe we both realized the gravity of what we'd done and decided to bury it. I tried to feel relieved, but all I felt was a crushing sense of loss. I realized that the touch on the couch hadn't just been about sex. It had been about being seen. And now that I had been seen, I couldn't go back to being a ghost. One afternoon, Julian was at the hardware store and I was in the garden, pulling weeds with a ferocity that probably looked like madness to the neighbors. I was sweating, my hands covered in dirt, when I heard the gate creak. I didn't even have to look up. I knew the rhythm of his walk. "Elena," he said. I stood up, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. He was standing by the rose bushes, looking older than he had a week ago. There were dark circles under his eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Gabriel," I said, though I didn't move to make him leave. I know, I tried to stay away. I went for a drive. I went to the city. I tried to forget the way you looked at me. He took a step toward me, his boots crunching on the gravel. But I can't. I can't go back to how it was before. I see you everywhere. We have to, I whispered. Think about Sarah. Think about Julian. This isn't just a little fling. This would destroy everything. It's already destroyed, he said, and his voice was flat, certain. The moment I touched you, the life you were living ended. You know it, and I know it. You're just pretending. Because you're afraid of the noise the glass will make when it breaks. He was right. I was terrified of the noise. I was terrified of the judgment, the shame, the wreckage of a life built over decades. But as I looked at him, standing there in the sunlight, I realized that the safe life I was protecting was already a ruin. It was a hollow shell, held together by habit and fear. That evening, Julian came home and complained about the price of lumber. He sat at the table and didn't notice that I hadn't eaten a bite of my dinner. He didn't notice that I was wearing the perfume I usually saved for anniversaries. He didn't notice me at all. He was looking at a flyer for a lawnmower, and in that moment, I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. The betrayal wasn't the kiss with Gabriel. The betrayal was the 10 years I had spent pretending that this was enough. The betrayal was the way I had let my own fire go out because I was afraid to ask for more wood. A few days later, Julian had to go out of town for a business conference. Usually these trips were lonely stretches of time where I'd binge watch old movies and eat popcorn for dinner. This time, the moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I felt a surge of adrenaline so strong it made me dizzy. Gabriel came over. That night, we didn't watch a movie. We didn't sit on the couch. We met in the kitchen, and before a single word could be exchanged, we were in each other's arms. It was a desperate, hungry collision. We moved to the guest room, the one Sarah stayed in when she visited, the one that felt neutral, away from the history of my marriage. Being with him was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical act. It was the emotional intensity. He touched me as if I were made of glass and gold. He looked at me with an openness that was almost painful. In that room, under the dim yellow light of a bedside lamp, I rediscovered my body. I remembered that I was capable of feeling, of wanting, of being overwhelmed. We lay in the aftermath. The sheets tangled around our legs, the room smelling of sweat and the faint scent of the jasmine bushes outside the window. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heart. "What happens tomorrow?" I asked. Gabriel ran a hand down my back, his touch lingering on the curve of my spine. "Tomorrow, the sun comes up, and you have to decide if you're going to live in the light or stay in the shadows." "It's not that simple," I sighed. "It is," he said. "It's the hardest simple thing in the world." The next morning, Gabriel was gone before the neighborhood woke up. I cleaned the guest room with a manic precision, stripping the sheets, vacuuming the floor, erasing every trace of him. I wanted to believe I could go back. I wanted to believe that I could tuck this experience away in a small box in the back of my mind and continue my life with Julian as if nothing had changed. But when Julian returned that evening, everything was different. I watched him walk through the front door, carrying his suitcase, complaining about the traffic. I saw the way he moved, heavy, slow, and different. I saw the house through his eyes, a collection of furniture and routines. And then I looked at my own hands, the hands that had held Gabriel, and I realized the charade was over. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit across the table from him for another 20 years and talk about the weather while my soul was screaming. "Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his monologue about the airport shuttle. He stopped, his hand on the banister. "Yeah, what is it, Elle? We need to talk. Truly talk." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in a long time. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the way my eyes wouldn't settle. A flicker of something passed over his face. Was it fear? Or was it relief? Is this about the boy? He asked out the question hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. What? Julian sighed and sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. He looked tired. Not just long day tired, but long life tired. "I'm not blind, Elena. I've seen the way he looks at you. I've seen the way you've been different lately. You've been awake. For the first time in a decade, you're actually in the room." I stood there, paralyzed. I didn't think. I didn't mean for it to happen. "Things like this don't just happen," Julian said, his voice devoid of anger. There was only a profound, hollow sadness. "They grow in the cracks." "We let the cracks get too big, Elena. I let them get big because I was tired, and you let them get big because you were lonely. We both stopped tending the garden a long time ago." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, the tears finally starting to fall. "Don't be," he said, looking up at me. "I'm sorry too. I'm sorry I didn't know how to keep you. I'm sorry I became a man who was satisfied with just being fine." He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He didn't call me names. In a way, his kindness was more devastating than any rage could have been. We sat in the hallway for a long time, the shadows lengthening around us, talking about the years we had lost and the distance we had allowed to grow. It wasn't a conversation about Gabriel. It was a conversation about us. Gabriel was just the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse of a bomb that had been sitting in our living room for years. The next few weeks were a blur of transition. We decided to separate. It was a quiet, clinical process. There were lawyers and papers and boxes. Sarah found out, of course. That was the hardest part. The look of betrayal on her face when she realized it was her son. That was a wound that I knew would never fully heal. She stopped taking my calls. Gabriel stopped coming by. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was half the size of the house, and the walls were thin, but it was mine. For the first time in my adult life, I was alone. No husband to care for, no best friend to appease, no expectations to meet. I spent the first month in a state of mourning. I mourned my marriage, my friendship with Sarah, and the comfortable lie I had lived for so long. I missed Gabriel, too. The physical ache of his absence was a constant companion. I wondered if he was thinking of me, if he regretted what we'd done, or if he was relieved to be free of the complexity of us. Then, one rainy Tuesday, there was a knock on my new door. I opened it to find Gabriel standing there, soaked to the bone. He didn't have a suitcase or a grand plan. He just had a look of stubborn determination. "I tried to stay away," he said, echoing his words from the garden. "But I realized that if I didn't come here today, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what if, and I'm tired of wondering." I looked at him, and then I looked back at my small, quiet apartment. I thought about the wreckage we had left behind and the uncertain road ahead. I knew that being with him would be difficult. I knew that our families might never forgive us. I knew that the age gap and the history would always be a shadow over our relationship. But then I thought about the alternative. I thought about going back to the ghost life, to the polite silence and the slow erosion of the soul, I stepped back and opened the door wider. "You're getting water all over my floor," I said, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Gabriel stepped inside, the cool scent of rain following him. He didn't reach for me immediately. He just looked around at my new space, at the paintings I'd started working on again, at the books on the coffee table. "It suits you," he said. "The light is better here. The light is better everywhere now." I replied, "We didn't know what the future held. We didn't know if we would last 6 months or 60 years. But as he finally took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine with that same familiar heat, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was making it happen. The scandal eventually settled into a dull roar. Sarah and I didn't speak for a year, but slowly, painfully, we began to find our way back to a new kind of friendship, one built on honesty rather than history. Julian moved on too, finding a woman who shared his love for quiet routines and early nights. He seemed happier, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders as well, thought Gabriel and I stayed together. It wasn't always easy. We had to navigate the whispers at the grocery store and the awkwardness of holiday dinners. But every time I looked at him, I was reminded of that night on the couch, the night the silence finally spoke. Learned that honesty is a destructive force, but it's also a generative one. It clears the ground so that something real can grow. My life wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't the one I had imagined for myself when I was 20, but it was mine. I was no longer a character in someone else's story, a background actor. In a play I didn't enjoy. The house I live in now is small, but the windows are always open. I paint until the sun goes down, and when Gabriel comes home, he doesn't just kiss my forehead out of habit. He looks at me. He sees me, and in the quiet moments when the world feels loud and the past tries to claw its way back, I remember the feeling of that first touch, the moment I chose to stop being invisible. The transition from the life I knew to the life I wanted was a violent one, a tearing of the fabric that had kept me warm for so long. But standing here now, in the middle of my own messy, complicated, beautiful reality, I realized that the cold was worth it. You can't find the sun if you're too afraid to leave the cave. I still think about that Tuesday night sometimes. The lions. On the screen, the blue light, the weight of a hand on my thigh. It wasn't a thunderstorm or a dramatic climax. It was just a decision to breathe, a decision to feel, a decision to finally, after all those years, say yes to myself. And as I sit on my new porch, watching the stars come out, I know I would do it all again. I would take the pain, the gossip, and the loss, because on the other side of that wreckage, I found a person I actually liked. I found Elena. The air is cool tonight, and the crickets are loud in the grass. Gabriel is inside, humming a tune I don't recognize. The light from the kitchen spills out onto the deck, casting a warm glow over everything. It's not a fairy tale ending. It's better. It's an ending where I am awake, and in this life, that is more than enough. I used to think that love was about staying. I used to think it was about endurance and sacrifice. But now I know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people around you is to leave. To leave the lies, the expectations, and the hollow versions of yourself behind. My marriage ended, but my life began. My friendship changed, but it became real. And Gabriel, he wasn't just a boy who grew up. He was the mirror that showed me I was still there, waiting to be found. I take a deep breath, the scent of the night air filling my lungs. I am not a ghost anymore. I am not a shadow. I am a woman who chose to be seen. And as the moon climbs, Higher into the sky, I realize that the silence isn't heavy anymore. It's peaceful. It's the silence of a house that is finally, truly at rest. The path here was jagged, littered with the broken pieces of the person I used to be. I remember the nights of agonizing guilt, the days when the weight of Sarah's disappointment felt like a physical pressure on my chest. I remember the look on Julian's face, not of anger, but of a quiet, resigned understanding that hurt worse than any shout. I remember the fear of the unknown, the terrifying realization that I was stepping off a cliff without knowing if I had a parachute. But then, I remember the first time I woke up in my new apartment. The sun was hitting a different corner of the room. The air felt lighter. I didn't have to check the temperature of the house or anticipate Julian's needs or perform the role of the content suburban wife. I could just be. I could drink my coffee in the silence and realize that the silence belonged to me, Gabriel, and I didn't rush into anything. We gave each other space to breathe, to process the chaos we had invited into our lives. We met for walks in the park, far away from the prying eyes of our old neighborhood. We talked about things we had never talked about before, our fears, our dreams, the things that kept us up at night. We built a foundation of words before we built a life of actions, he told me once, as we sat on a bench watching the ducks on the pond, that he had loved me since he was 19. Not as a mother figure, but as a person who seemed to contain a whole world of color that she was keeping hidden. He said he used to watch me in the garden and wonder why I always looked like I was waiting for a bus that was never going to come. I didn't think I had a choice, I told him. We always have a choice, he said, taking my hand. Sometimes the choice is just between two different kinds of pain, but one of them leads to a dead end and the other leads to a road. I chose the road. It's a winding road, full of potholes and steep climbs, but the view is spectacular. There are moments, even now, when I feel a pang of regret for the way things happened. I wish I hadn't hurt Julian. I wish I hadn't fractured my relationship with Sarah. I wish I could have found a way to be honest without being destructive, but life is rarely that clean. Sometimes you have to break the old structure to build something. That actually fits. I've started painting again, not the polite watercolors I used to do for charity auctions, but big, messy, vibrant oils. My studio is the second bedroom of my apartment, and it smells of turpentine and possibility. When I paint, I feel a connection to myself that I haven't felt since I was a girl. I'm not painting for anyone else. I'm painting because the colors need to come out. Gabriel comes over in the evenings after he finishes work. He doesn't live here yet. We're taking it slow, but his presence is woven into the fabric of my new life. He sits on the stool in the corner of the studio and watches me work. He doesn't ask me what I'm making or tell me it's nice. He just sits there, a quiet, supportive force, letting me be exactly who I am. Sometimes we go back to that nature. Documentary we were watching that first night. We laugh about it now, how the lions were doing their thing while we were busy ruining our lives, but we both know it wasn't a ruin. It was a renovation. Julian and I met for coffee a few months ago. It was the first time we'd seen each other since the divorce was finalized. He looked good. He'd lost some weight and there was a new energy in his eyes. He told me he'd started traveling, something he'd always said he was too tired to do. I'm glad you're doing well, Elle, he said, and for the first time, I knew he meant it. I'm glad you are too, Julian. We didn't talk about Gabriel. We didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer a wall. It was just a space where a long story had finally ended. We were no longer ghosts. We were just two people who had outgrown each other, and we were finally okay with that. Sarah called me last week. It was a short conversation, mostly about her work and the neighborhood gossip, but it was a start. She didn't mention Gabriel, and I didn't push. We're navigating a new territory, one where the old rules don't apply. It will take time, maybe a lot of time. But the fact that she called is enough daunt tonight. The moon is a silver sliver in the sky. I'm sitting at my small dining table, the remains of a dinner for two scattered across the surface. Gabriel is in the other room, his low voice drifting through the doorway as he talks on the phone. I feel a sense of peace so profound it's almost startling. I think about the woman on the couch, the one who was afraid to breathe, the one who thought her life was over because she had reached a certain age. I want to reach back through time and tell her that she's wrong. I want to tell her that the fear is just the wind before the dawn. I want to tell her that she is worth the mess, worth the noise, and worth the love she's been denying herself, but I don't have to, because I am her and she is me, and we are finally undeniably home. The hum of the fridge is still there, but it doesn't sound like a clock ticking down my life anymore. It sounds like a heart beating. My heart, steady, strong, and wide awake. The night is long, but I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. I know that the sun will come up, and when it does, it will find me standing in the light, ready for whatever the next chapter holds. I am Elena. I am a painter. I am a woman who loves and is loved. And for the first time in my life, that is exactly who I want to be. The story didn't end with a touch on a couch. It began there. And as I look out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, I realize that the best parts are yet to come. The road is open, the engine is running, and I'm finally the one behind the wheel. I reach out and turn off the lamp. The room is plunged into shadows, but I don't mind. I know exactly where I am. I know exactly where I'm going. And for the first time, I'm not afraid of what I'll find when I get there. The silence is mine. The night is mine. The life is mine. And it is beautiful. I close my eyes and listen to the world. It's a symphony of small sounds, the wind. In the trees, the distant hum of traffic, the steady breathing of the man in the next room. It's a symphony I finally know how to hear. And as I drift off to sleep, I know that tomorrow I'll wake up and do it all over again. I live, I'll love, I'll be. And that is the most satisfying end I could have ever imagined.